Welcome everyone, I'm Angela, the Learning Lead at Someday, and I'm joined by Lindsay, Someday's co-founder and head of accounting and education. We're going to be delving into the GHG protocol's recent Scope 3 stakeholder survey response and unpacking what the feedback means over the next few series. So firstly, what is the GHG protocol and what's the Scope 3 survey all about? Well, the GHG protocol has been the standard provider and foundation for carbon accounting for businesses. It's a standard that's been around since the early 2000s and 2010s. And since then, obviously, many things in carbon counting has changed quite a bit. And so they've started this consultation process to see how the standards could be improved to fit the needs of businesses nowadays. And Scope 3 emissions are often representing about 80 to 90% of a business's emissions profile, are all indirect emissions associated with their value chain. So from any goods or services a business buys from their suppliers, basically. Overall feedback did show they wanted more standard guidance from the GHG protocol on calculation methods, approaches, as well as industry-specific guidance. It was acknowledging there is quite a lot of flexibility and optionality within the GHG protocol, so things aren't quite an apples-to-apples sort of comparison for reporting on your greenhouse gas emissions for businesses. But with today's video, we're going to take a look at the spend-based approach first. Many called for the spend-based calculation methods for emissions to be removed, phased out, or limited its use as sort of hotspot identification. There's been quite a lot of criticism around it, as many did say it doesn't provide reliable information that informs decarbonization strategies, so they're really calling for the need of high-quality data. On page 46, we did see quite a few listed recommendations from respondents. Let's unpack what these all mean. So I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay. What do you think of the first one? It says they want to phase out these unreliable methods, really specifically calling out the spend-based method. Do you think that's realistic?
So I think to take a step back, essentially under the GHG protocol for some of these key Scope 3 categories, businesses can use the spend-based approach, which is essentially taking dollars spent on a particular good or service and then multiplying it by a spend-based emissions factor to get a high-level calculation of the emissions associated with that activity. So as an alternative to that, there's a couple of other methods, activity-based, which is linked to the actual physical good or service that's been purchased rather than the dollars spent on it. And then ideally, we're moving to a world where we're using supplier-specific information. So this will mean that essentially we're going out and asking the vendor of our goods and services, understanding their emissions profile and how those emissions are then allocated to the goods and services that we procure. So ideally, over time, businesses are going to be moving to that supplier-specific method. That has lots of advantages, both in terms of data quality, but then also it means that businesses with specific targets of reduction over time, if they're trying to get to net zero, it really becomes critical to understand the emissions of your suppliers because their reduction efforts are going to cascade through into your overall Scope 3 reduction efforts. Without that, if we're relying on the spend-based method, the only real lever that we have to pull is to spend less or hope that the spend-based factor magically reduces over time. I think this idea of phasing out spend-based calculations, I can see where it comes from and I can see why people think it's required by the GHG protocol. But certainly my view on this is that the market itself will largely drive the requirement to essentially phase this out. Businesses, especially with their key strategic suppliers, will want to understand their actual emissions rather than relying on a spend-based calculation. But in terms of actually phasing it out, it does have its uses in that organizations that have a small portion of their overall emissions contributing to a specific customer, this might not be the most appropriate kind of use of resources to collect primary data associated with those, especially if it relates to smaller kind of SMB suppliers. And so spend-based can potentially fill data quality gaps, certainly in the short term, but there's a question in terms of longer term, whether that persists as something that's going to be a required need. So certainly in my view, I think it's probably premature to suggest that we get rid of the spend-based approach. It provides some kind of context in terms of estimating emissions, but kind of the broad application of it. And certainly what we see from a lot of the inventories currently is that larger businesses will default to the spend-based, which I think this is the behavior that we want to avoid. We don't want businesses to be specifically using the spend-based for all of their purchase goods and services calculations. They want to be kind of using other methods that are going to be more accurate for a larger portion of their overall assessment. And then where it's kind of that information isn't available, using spend as a last resort, like it is currently outlined within the GHG protocol.
Well, that's very interesting. Like you mentioned, a lot of businesses are sort of showing the behavior of defaulting to spend based right now. And that's not really the behavior that the GHG protocol might have intended to be driving. It's more of a fallback method. And this kind of ties into the second bullet point of, making mandatory the improvement of calculation methods and data quality over time. What do you think of that suggestion? Do you think it is the GHG protocol's place to make it mandatory?
Yeah, certainly my view is that businesses are going to do the calculation of the scope 3 emissions in a way that's consistent with their business objectives and their goals. So for some businesses, the calculation of scope 3 might be more of that kind of hotspot based approach. To be honest, there's nothing wrong with that, depending on what your specific outcomes you're trying to achieve out of the process are. But where this becomes really critical is if we don't have transparency and visibility into that kind of calculation. It means that users of that information can't make their own decisions around either procuring goods and services from you, investing in you, or even to the extent that you want to be kind of looking at incorporating your emissions calculation into the supply chain emissions calculation under scope 3 for a specific customer. They're going to want to understand what that kind of data quality is, and they're going to critically want to make their own professional judgment to say, is that information of high enough quality to replace a spend-based average or an average database calculation within my inventory? If it's not, then the user is essentially, their kind of carbon accounting is not fit for purpose for the activities of their customer. And so I think naturally we'll start to see a shift in terms of improved calculation methods being used by businesses to fit a certain purpose, which is that supplier specific information. So I think naturally over time, the data quality will improve, because that's the expectation of stakeholders that are using this information. I don't necessarily think that the GHG protocol needs to mandate this, but it needs to be specific in terms of how those numbers are calculated and how do we get to a point where we can have an indication of data quality that can be consistent across businesses. So those users of the carbon accounting information can make their own decisions around whether that information is fit for purpose for their specific objectives.
So what I'm really hearing is the market and the use of those report will really dictate the movement towards higher quality data for what they need for their businesses to understand what strategies to deploy, what decisions they need to make, what data do they actually need to be able to make those decisions. This kind of ties into our next point, having a calculation method quality hierarchy, sort of quantifying what exactly is this calculation method and is that quality usable for the user. What's your thoughts on creating a sort of data quality hierarchy method?
So it's a great point. Certainly, in my view, the clarity around data quality hierarchy is going to be really important moving forward. Essentially, businesses are going to want to know when they should be utilizing specific types of data and calculation methods and what that means for their overall assessment. It's not just the specific method that's used, it's other kind of key indicators such as reliability, completeness, correlation in terms of time, geographic correlation, and representativeness. I think having that codified in a way that users can easily understand the relative quality of information that they're collecting and report on that to stakeholders is going to be really key. So I think having this stepped out in a systematic way is going to be really helpful for reporting across the board and mean that businesses can start to actually action some of these quality improvements in a way that's going to be consistent and essentially efficient for their processes as well.
Those are very good points. Say, if you were a business, Lindsay, if you've reached out to your suppliers to ask for that information, ask for the emissions data, what sort of information do you need from your suppliers to be able to make that judgment call of whether their sort of calculated emissions factor is better than using just a spend-based proxy emission factor? What would you be looking for?
If you think about things like temporal correlation, which is basically how closely is the time period associated with the emissions calculation linked to the reporting period that you're currently in. So it's going to be less quality information if you're using the primary emissions information from 10 years ago from a supplier you're buying from than the primary emissions from last year. Another key one is the idea of completeness. So this is touched on from a lot of the feedback from respondents around completeness of the data that's provided. So we see generally under scope 3, there's 15 categories. In order for a primary emissions factor to be complete, it needs to include scope 1 and 2, as well as the upstream categories under scope 3. So that's what's known as cradle to gate. So if there's gaps in that, essentially the data is not going to be complete, and we might be understating the emissions associated with the goods and services that we're procuring if we're using that incomplete emissions factor in our calculation. Obviously, that means it's either lower quality or is not going to be fit for the intended purpose. And so we need to weigh up these kind of key factors around items like completeness to then understand, can this be used for this purpose? And if we're saying no, it can't, then we're going to need a fallback kind of method to calculate emissions. The suppliers aren't magically going to get better quality data overnight. And so they're also on a journey here. So it's really understanding kind of some of those key indicators and figuring out if it meets that base threshold to be able to use within the inventory. But I think businesses need to evaluate quite carefully when they're looking to use the supplier specific method, because we do see a lot of variability in the quality of this information that comes through from people that are filling in supplier engagement surveys.
It's a really good reminder that it's not going to happen overnight, that we're going to get perfect supplier data. And it is a journey that we're all sort of going through. And so understanding what exactly these numbers mean and being transparent about it. The next point is quite interesting, mandating the application of contingency factors. What do you think about that? That adding like a 20% for results quantified using spend-based method. What do you think are the pros and cons in this approach, and what might be the risks associated with going this way?
I can definitely see where this recommendation has originated from. The idea here is that we essentially want to be kind of creating an incentive for users to be using high quality information. And so in reality, having low quality data doesn't necessarily mean the emissions are going to be higher. It just means that they're going to be more uncertain. So it could be higher or lower. And so by kind of arbitrarily increasing the emissions associated with the business, essentially we're kind of padding that out in a way that might not necessarily represent the underlying emissions of the business. This can call into question, I guess, the actual number and mean that people lose trust around the specific activities or reported data. So I think certainly from my point of view, focusing more on, okay, what is our best estimate of the emissions, and then being clear around the kind of error bars associated with that. So is this kind of a plus or minus 50% kind of calculation, or is it a plus or minus 10% kind of calculation? That information, in my view, is much more useful to users. And I think this kind of punitive approach of adding a contingency is probably less relevant for a lot of businesses, and businesses are probably going to want to know the actual emissions associated with the business, or at least our best guess, rather than having this kind of buffer incorporated into the approach. It kind of damages comparability in a lot of ways as well.
On that note of comparability, you did mention like low quality data right now might be a plus or minus of what the actual underlying emissions are. And like as you improve on the quality of your data over time, you might see emissions go up or go down. Like we've seen these examples happen in real life. There might be some fear associated with that improved data quality with the emissions going up. How do we kind of get around that fear of that and actually drive the right behaviors?
It's definitely an interesting question that we're seeing emerging. And as you say, we're seeing examples from our user base that are experiencing this kind of relative pain at the moment, where they potentially have used specific approaches in the past that, as they've updated those, might have resulted in their emissions actually going up. So I think what our stakeholders appreciate is really a transparent kind of discussion around previous approaches that have been adopted and how the business is changing and improving over time. Certainly everyone's on a journey with the calculation of specifically scope 3, where data quality has been historically low. And so I think being really transparent around the calculation methods that you've used and the potential impact of that is really important. To the extent that you've had a historical approach that might have been misaligned, there's some guidance, and certainly some of the recommendation from respondents around kind of changes to baseline or targets is definitely pertinent here. But the idea is having high quality data means the noise within your GHG inventory is going to go down over time, and mean that the decisions that you make within the business to reduce your emissions are going to be more aligned with the reported output. So I think being able to kind of more tightly correlate action with impact then becomes quite important as we're looking to move towards specific targets in the future. So without that, there's a lot of noise in the calculation. And so initially that noise might mean the emissions go up or down at some amount, but I think having the longer term view of we need to increase data quality, that noise is reduced, and our business decisions can then demonstrate the result associated with those is really the critical factor. And I think in the short term, and especially as mandatory reporting comes in some jurisdictions, there is going to be a lot of adjustment to historic data as part of that. And I think stakeholders need to be appreciative and compassionate around that kind of those changes. It's definitely a sign of progress, and it means we're moving in the right direction, even though it's kind of potentially a little bit painful to see emissions going up. It's certainly a journey that people are on.
Yeah, it's a bit of a short-term pain for the long-term gain, but it's not perfection that we're striving for. We're really striving for progress, and it's reducing those noise so that we can make better decisions from all of it. From all of this feedback in the survey, we can kind of clearly see the direction of travel for carbon accounting and GHG reporting is moving away from, say, using that low quality data using spend base and moving towards that high quality and that sort of same robustness, transparency. Advisors have a huge role to help businesses put in the right processes and controls in place to help sort of facilitate that data collection that leads to decision useful reporting. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's series. This is the first part of our series. Up next, we'll be unpacking the feedback around emissions factors. So if you're keen to chat more on any of this, just give us a shout. Thanks for joining us today.